Once upon a time, there was a king who owned a lot of land. He was very industrious. He had lots of things going on, and so he had lots of servants. And he decided it was time for a trip. So he called them together and he got them ready and said, I need you to do this very important task. And he gave them an assignment. And so they listened carefully, and they began to even sort of take notes of what to do. And he went off on his journey, and he left them in charge. He was trusting them. He believed they would be able to tackle this important assignment. And so they began to do the work he had asked them to do. They worked diligently, and actually they were quite successful at achieving the goals that were set, at doing this work, this important work that the king had asked them to do. Well, part of that work included, growing and getting more people involved with the work. And so as they succeeded, more and more people came and joined in, which was very successful and encouraging and exciting. And, there were seasons of growth and seasons of less growth, expansion and contraction. But overall, the chart was up and to the right. And there was growth going on. And it was good. So they thought, how can we do this even better? This is a very important mission. We need to be about this mission. So we can get better at this mission if we teach more and more people about this mission. So they started to build educational centers. And they started to teach more and more, and they have teachers come in and teach, and then they would multiply. They'd teach teachers to be teachers, and then they'd teach more people, and then they'd build more education centers, bigger and bigger and bigger, until they had many, many universities even, full of education, so that everybody could know this important mission. And there was classrooms filled everywhere, all over, with important and very astute students. But those who were in leadership discovered there's a bit of a gap. Now, they didn't know when the king was going to come back, but they started to realize that the mission started to shift from actually the task that the king had given them to building centers to help educate people about the task that the king had given them. And they had forgot that there's more than one way to learn. That actually there's other ways to learn beyond the classroom. And so they decided they needed to expand their educational endeavors. And they began to go back to the methods that the king had taught the servants in the first place. As I think about where we're at in the church, there's a number of things that would be parallel with this story. One of the things that we have tended to do in the church, and as not just our church, but as the church in the Western world, I would say, is we've tended to value the classroom type experience very highly. But there are more ways to learn than just in a classroom. Now, today we're talking about discipleship. And there are things to be learned in a lecture setting like this. We call it a sermon. But it's teaching. And there's definitely things, and there's a place for it. But there's also some limitations to this setting. When we talk about disciples, or making disciples, or discipleship, we need to know what it means. What does it mean to be a disciple? Well, the word disciple means learner, student, follower, pupil. You get the sense. To be a disciple is to be a student of something and even someone. And in the biblical sense, it's definitely of someone, and that someone is Jesus. It's more than just being a student of Jesus or learning what he said. It's about what he did and how he did it. We want to be more than just a student. We want to be a follower. And we have this passage in Matthew 28 called the Great Commission. We'll read that here. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee. Jesus has already died and rose again. He's preparing to speak to his disciples one last time. The mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age." This is known as the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, given to the disciples and meant to be handed down. Well, we find ourselves in a place where we can be good students, and if you were to observe what churches do, we tend to really focus on the classroom type of setting, right? We call it a little differently, but in the end, our educational system that we've grown up with, that we've been a part of, has evolved, and we tend to do things fairly school-like. We have a start time, we have attendance, we're seated in pews, in rows, not in circles. Even the kids, we have Sunday school. Wait, Sunday what? Sunday school. It's good. It's needed. It's part of it. But it's not all of it. And so what does it mean to be a disciple? And what I want to talk about today is some of those gaps. Some of where I think we are and where we want to be going, where we want to get to. We want to be trending in a certain direction. So, when somebody asks you for the hope that you have, Peter said we should all be prepared to give an answer for the hope that we carry. And so that was sort of my challenge to you, is to say, hey, are you ready if somebody asks you about your hope? Are we displaying hope in our lives? And if somebody asked us, would we know what to say? And have we given that some thought? That is a task for a disciple, for a follower of Jesus. So there's still sort of a stage that we find people in, and we talked about it last week, that would be a stage where somebody would be known as, in the Bible, they're called lost. Somebody who does not know Jesus. Somebody who has not embraced Jesus. Maybe they've heard of him. They've heard the name, but they don't know who he is or what he does. And so they haven't accepted the truth of Jesus Christ, and they would be considered lost. Or, sometimes we could call them curious. They might be in a place of curiosity, where they begin to ask questions. They begin to notice the hope that you have, or notice the things that are going differently in your life, or the way you interact with your family, or the way you work, whatever it is. They start to notice something, and they start to get a little more curious. Well, that's a wonderful place to be. It's great to encounter people who are curious. So if you get the chance to share with them, they can move from step one to step two. So we have discipleship, and we have Jesus in the center. We have someone outside here that would be lost or curious. And then they would move into this center part, and they would become a disciple. Somebody who's following Jesus begins to become a believer. They become a believer, and they become a disciple. They become a student of Jesus. As they do that, they begin to receive things. They're recipients, and they are also responders. So they've heard the good news of Jesus. they've received it, they've responded to it. They say, yeah, I want some of that. I want to be a disciple. So they kind of get in. They get committed to Jesus. They start to learn. They become a student of Jesus, a pupil. And again, Jesus' main model was modeling. It wasn't just teaching from a classroom, but modeling. Then there's a sort of a third phase. The church tends to lag behind a little bit, becoming a discipler, moving from disciple to discipler. Okay? And these traits tend to be, again, they're embracing it more. They tend to be a bit more of a giver and a sender. They understand that there's a commission, there's something to be doing, to be making disciples. So in this category is more about being a disciple, and this one has moved on to making disciples. And then from here, it loops back over to here. And there's connections to be made with those who are lost and or curious. So this just helps us. This was from a concept from Gil Stafford's book, Theology for Disciples. But I thought it was helpful because sometimes we can think that, or maybe just pastors, we can think, oh, we're just failing. We're not doing a good enough job at helping people be disciplers. And maybe that's true, but there is a grace there. There's sort of a process to this. We start off not knowing anything about Jesus or not embracing it. We get curious and we become a disciple. We say, yeah, I want to learn more. I want to follow. And as we follow the Savior and we journey with Him, we find, oh, the call is even bigger and deeper than I thought. It's more than just being a recipient and a responder. It's more than just receiving good teaching or just being a disciple. But as we are coming to terms with being a disciple, the next level is becoming a discipler. And this is where often we have not been taught. We've not been taught a lot about being a discipler. So we say, well, yeah, I go to church. That's how I be a disciple, right? That's how I should be a disciple. I go to church. I go to the Bible study and I take the class and I watch sermons and I listen to them and that's what I do. You're like, yes, okay, that's good. But it's very much a classroom model. We receive information. But we all know that there's a difference between receiving information and living it out. And so the first model of education tends to be classroom. The second is apprenticeship. Now, some of you have gone through apprenticeships. Some of you are in apprenticeships. And you know, oh yeah, there's a classroom component, but then there's also the work component. There's the application component where we say, you know what? We don't give a journeyman ticket to somebody who read the books and just wrote the tests, but never actually did the work. Right? If they don't know, if they've never actually connected wires for electricity, or if they've never actually taken out an engine or rebuilt it or done the work, or they've never actually worked on the plumbing and they've only done book work in the classroom, would you want them working in your house? Or if you take it up a level, what about a doctor who said, oh, no, I read all the books. Well, where did you do your residency? Oh, I didn't. I got my degree online. You're like, okay, I'm on to the next one. I don't want an online doctor to be operating on me, right? I'm sure you got great grades, but if your hands have not done the work, there's a level of information and competency that's missing because you haven't done the work. Now, I'm sure you did really well and you aced your exams, but that scalpel is not coming anywhere near me. Now, unlike that, this is where I think one of the gaps that we have in moving from being a disciple to being a discipler, and I think this is kind of, because we're so in this education model, we really think and believe that, and we have it where we reward finishing education, right? Graduations. Congratulations, you got your certificate, you finished your diploma, you got your degree, you got your ticket, and now you can begin to go do the work, right? And so sometimes I think we never really process that you don't graduate in being a disciple or being a Christian. There's no graduation comes when you leave this earth, when your life is done. And so then we feel like we're not ready because we have not graduated yet. So we say, well, I can't be a discipler because I haven't graduated. And I think this is one of those hesitations that we run into. I know I have. And so we say, well, yeah, I follow Jesus. Yeah, I'm a disciple. I go to church. You know, I'm a responder to the teaching. I try to live it out, and I work at being a disciple. And you are. If that's you, you are, right? You're still a disciple. You're still centered on Jesus. But the next step that Jesus instructed his disciples, the next teaching is to go do, to begin to make disciples, to be a discipler, not just a recipient, but a giver, a sender, one who imparts, one who then helps someone else become a disciple. Now here's the other thing that I hope can take down the tension, because maybe you're feeling uncomfortable right now. Like, here's the thing. While there's no graduation, the good news is also that you're not making a disciple of you. You're making a disciple of him. So when you're called to make a disciple, it's not to say you want someone to do everything that you do. See, because this is the other thing that's the hurdle, is we say, well, I didn't graduate discipleship school, so how am I ready to go make disciples? And I'm a very flawed human being, and no one's more aware of that than me. So I don't want people in my business or to know how flawed I really am. I just want to stumble forward and try to follow Jesus as best I can. And I don't want anybody watching me do that, because we think we're not good enough. But it's more like what Paul wrote. He said, follow me as I follow Christ. Right? Being a discipler doesn't mean that you're wanting somebody to watch and do everything that you do to follow you. You're pointing them to Jesus. And so they're watching you how you follow Jesus. And then you encourage them to follow Jesus in similar ways. You help them. You would pray with them to say, wow, that sounds like a tough situation. Let's bring that to Jesus. Yeah, I'm not sure either. Let's bring that to Jesus. Well, here's what we did when we had that, and we brought it to Jesus. So then, as a discipler, part of what you're modeling is just how to bring things to Jesus. It's identifying what has Jesus called you to do. Who has he called you to reach? What gifts has he called you to utilize for the kingdom? Because they're going to be different than mine. So you're not going to be a disciple of Nathan. I'm not making disciples of Nathan. I want to make disciples of Jesus. And each of us is called to do this. And the church too often, and Christians, we've gotten stuck on this side. Right? We're all surrounding and on the journey of following Jesus. Okay? So there's nothing question about your salvation here or anything like that. But we want to move from just being a recipient to being someone who gives. Somebody who is sent out. Somebody who can help bring others in. And that happens with evangelism, by being prepared to share good news. But even then, Jesus didn't just say, go and make converts. He said, go and make disciples. Right? Like, don't just get people in the door. Help them learn how to live with me. But we just feel like we're not ready to do it. We say, well, I don't want people looking at my life. So I don't want to make disciples. I don't trust myself. But we have the Holy Spirit that can help us point others to Jesus as we make disciples. We can do a lot of the things that we've been taught. We've been good recipients. We've responded to what we've heard. But we get stuck because we haven't ever made that jump across to the side where we say, I acknowledge that part of what I'm being asked to do is to make disciples. Part of it means that we need to be closer to people. There's a level of vulnerability that comes from making disciples. No, it doesn't mean that we have to do it with everybody. That's not even how Jesus did it, right? He had 3, he had 12, a bigger crowd. Like, it went out and out, but there was only a few that were real close. But part of the intimidating factor is, what if somebody gets into my life and gets to see what I'm really like? What about when I make mistakes? What about when I, use bad words? What about when I do something that shouldn't be imitated? Well, then what you do is you imitate what a disciple would do. I would ask for forgiveness. I would go make amends. I would reconcile. These are part of the things that is part of the life of the Christian too. And our first call when we have children is to be discipling our children. And that's an intimidating thing. When you're a parent, it's really intimidating. It's this very similar type of thing. Even when you go from having no kids to having a kid, all of a sudden you're like, somebody's watching you all the time. Someone else's needs are important, and even more important than your needs. And you're like, well, I didn't think I was selfish. It was just me. It was just us. I didn't feel very selfish, but then Junior came along, and now Junior always gets the attention. We've got to feed him and change him and all these things, right? Man, so demanding. And you start to realize, I guess I had a little bit of selfishness in there. I guess there were some things that I needed to grow up in as well. And sometimes this is the challenge too of moving over, right? Becoming a discipler. We say, now I'm going to have to change. I have to acknowledge the fact that I'm an example to other people. I don't want to be an example. Have you ever had that with your kids? Have you ever said, I wish they weren't watching? Or I wish they weren't watching what I just did. Well, then there's the opportunity to model. Hey, I'm sorry. So we got to model forgiveness. There's a benefit. There's a benefit to you learning to lay down your life for someone else. For you learning to share your life with someone else. There's a benefit. But I think most of us are in this area of like, I want to be a disciple. I am a disciple. I want to follow Jesus well. And being a discipler is actually really intimidating. Or maybe you're here and you're just curious. And you're like, well, I don't know. What is this about? What is Jesus about? Or maybe you are ready and you say, yes, I know I should be a discipler, but I'm not sure how to do that. And I've been there. Because most of the model that we've engaged with as a church, and as most of us in church all our lives, have engaged in very much a classroom model. So it means that the idea of apprenticeship, or getting close to someone to see how they work or how they live for Jesus, is awkward and uncomfortable for us. That's okay. That's okay. There's lots of things in our lives that are awkward and uncomfortable that we learn to overcome. Sometimes we need that reminder. I can do hard things. And we're not alone. The Holy Spirit can help us discern how and when to do this. And part of what I want to set us up for is to say, in the future, we are heading, I've been giving thought to this, to say, how do we do this better? How do we do this as a community of people, of disciples? How do I help you, and how do I do it better to become disciplers? And what does that look like? The how. So when I was traveling in March, I was able to engage with some friends, and I know that they do this well. And so I chatted with them, and I just said, look, you don't have to convince me that I need to make disciples. What I want to know is, how do you do it? How do you guys do it? And I asked them all sorts of questions. And it was very insightful and very helpful, because it's so much simpler than I thought. And for me, the default was like, well, what book do you need to read? What class do you take? What Bible study do you hold? The limitations that we've camped out in the model of classroom for so long, that when it's time to go into the shop and turn a wrench, we're like, oh, I don't know, I might get dirty. Like, what's that thing? It doesn't look like in the book. In the book, it's supposed to be over here, and there it's over there. So there's an encouragement to say, okay, well, might be a little bumpy, but you know what? It's time to get dirty. Like, how do we start to take some risk? To say, hey, let's prayerfully consider what phase we're at and what God is calling us to next. What's your next step? If you're out here, or you're lost, or you're curious, maybe your next step is to become a disciple, to learn more about Jesus. What is that thing? What do I need to start doing? Reading, being, engaging with. But if you're here, how long have you been there? Maybe you're pretty new as a disciple. Maybe this is the first time you've heard this. That's okay, great. I'm glad you're hearing it. You're not like, Jesus doesn't love you any less. Now that we've become aware of where we're at, we can become aware of where we want to go, or where Jesus is calling us to go. And so then, what are those next steps? What do I need to do to become a discipler? And that's where I would love to have a conversation with you. I hope this message sits with you for a while, to say, yeah, because as we continue to plan things for this year, the conversations I had with my friends in Africa, as they described what they do to be disciplers, it's not complicated. It's actually quite simple. Many of you are doing these core things already. And what it takes is an openness to invite someone else into your life and to be able to have conversations with them, to build connection with them, and to help them connect to Jesus. But I think about what happens as we engage in this. One of the things that happens is, again, I was reading these three models. There's classroom, there's apprentice, and there's immersion. This is the third way of learning. What happens as we begin to engage in this is we begin to develop a culture of disciples who make disciples. It starts to become who we are and what we do. It becomes normal for us. Now, it takes a while. It'll take a while. But the neat thing is, say, when you're learning a language, now some of you are on Duolingo. There's an app for that, right? And you can be like, oh, I'm learning German, or I'm learning Spanish, or whatever. And, if you miss a couple of days, there's a notification there, and then there's a bird face on this app, and it starts to get frown or sad or mad at you if you're missing days of learning this language, and trying to prompt you to come back and learn your language more, right? But the best way to learn a language is there's some classroom study, but then it's to actually speak with people who speak the language. And when you go and you live in a country that speaks the language. You're immersed in it. And it takes some time, but you begin over a couple of years. They say it takes about 2 years for the average person. As you've learned some classroom, right? Because there's all these things about feminine and masculine and neuter, and there's verb tenses and stuff like that, right? All that exciting stuff. But as you live in the culture, you begin to pick it up because you're hearing it and you're engaging with it and you're reading it and you're immersed in it. And as we begin to take intention to begin to move from being a disciple to disciplers, as God stirs in your heart, in your spirit, and moves in our congregation to become disciplers, to open our lives up to being willing to engage with this, then more people become disciples. And it becomes more normal for us to expect disciples to become disciplers. Right? So it's a good church growth strategy because Jesus gave it to us. Again, we're not making disciples of us. We're making disciples of Him. But if we're able to begin to do this and pay attention a little more to say, God, what are you calling me to? Where am I at here? What's my next step? To believe that the Holy Spirit will speak to us and lead us. And who might I disciple? That's another great question. Sometimes disciples are made with people who are lost or curious, and they come in, and it includes evangelism, and they come in. Other times, sometimes we're making disciples with people who are still in this category. They're in the responder, recipient. They've learned how to be a disciple pretty good. The next step for them to grow in their maturity is for them to learn how to make disciples. That's the question today is, what's your next step? Where are you at? What's your next step? And that's what I want you to pray about. And please talk to me. Talk to me about it. To say, I think I need to move to becoming a discipler. What would that look like? Well, I've got some ideas. And I'd like to see that happen a bit more within our congregation. Because it's not complicated, but it does take some intention. And the reality is, you are more ready than you think. You are more ready than you think. You say, well, I didn't get the certificate. I didn't graduate. Well, this is the apprenticeship part. Well, you did the book part already for however many years. Now we got to get dirty. We got to start putting things into practice and allowing some other people into our lives in ways that will help us make disciples.